Hello, everyone. Welcome to our QH webinar. This should be the last webinar of this year. So we are very happy to have Professor Yiling Zhao to talk about her paper on the relationship between home economics and women's access to science. Professor Zhao is now in Peking University School of Economics. She received her PhD in economics from Northwestern University. Professor Zhao will give a 1-hour presentation followed by our discussion and Q&A. Today, we are simply happy to have Professor Sang-Yong Park as our discussant. Professor Park is our colleague and Hong Kong U Faculty of Business and Economics. Professor Park is also working on development issue pertaining to history, labor, and other interesting topics. For the audience, please feel free to drop your question in our Q&A box. And later in the Q&A session, we will pick up your question for Professor Zhao's answer and response. So Professor Zhao, we can start now.
Okay. Let me share my screen. All right.
Yeah.
All right. So thank you so much for the invitation, and thank you so much for all the attendance. Today, I'm going to talk about home economics and women's gateway to science. This is joint work with my incredible co-author. I hope he's in the audience right now, Mike Andrews, who is currently assistant professor at University of Maryland, Baltimore County. Okay, so this paper is motivated by why individuals choose different types of education. So there's a huge literature that studies education attainment and the return to levels of education, but there's much less work on why individuals choose different types of education. However, choosing different types of education leads to very different subsequent occupation paths and pay. For example, if we look at the wage gap between electric engineering major and general education majors, the wage gap is almost as large as the wage gap between college graduates and high school graduates. Among college educated people, okay, choosing a college major is a decision that everyone has to make, and is a very salient decision that everyone has to make. If you're interested in the gender gap, college major is an important determinant of the pay gap between college educated men and women. Now, both in China and in the US, there are policy debates on what kind of education or curriculum that we should provide to our children and young people. And there's a calling for higher enrollment in STEM fields, so science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. However, it's kind of impossible to force people to take certain major. So it's important to understand why people demand different types of major, or particularly in STEM. All right. So there's a lot of study that focus on STEM. And we know that ability matters a lot in choosing a college major, but ability only matters to a certain extent. For example, if math is a good measure of quantitative ability, we see that math is not a determinant of whether individual will participate in STEM. Okay, so especially for women who do well in math at the secondary level, they're still preferring a career in medicine or law than the career in STEM. And there is increasing evidence that what matters in college major choices is preferences. So what are preferences? Well, it's the same. I think I like it. Okay, and preferences are related to non-pecuniary, so not related to expected returns. Non-pecuniary attributes are things like, will my parents approve? Will I enjoy the coursework? Will I enjoy the potential occupation after I graduate? Okay. And in a systematic study, Zavar 2009 find that these non-pecuniary attributes matter a lot more than pecuniary attributes. So for men, the pecuniary attributes and preferences play equal importance, and for women, the non-pecuniary attributes, so preferences, matters twice as much. All right, so what are preferences, right? So if we just look at preferences in STEM today, gendered preferences in STEM today, it's true that women are underrepresented in STEM overall, but they are actually well represented in math and science combined. So there's 53% of women in math and science majors at undergraduate level. And within science, we see that women have came to dominate life sciences, so biological sciences and psychology, okay? So it's close to 60%, so psychology and biological sciences had close to 60% of women in it. So given that STEM field is overall quite hardcore and quantitative, we want to understand why is it easier for women to go into a certain STEM major than others. So today I'm going to talk about I will say a hypothesis, a past dependence hypothesis to these gendered education preferences. I'm going to argue that a historical shock, aka the development of home economics curriculum, made it much easier for women to go to life sciences. All right, so the event took place around the turn of the earlier 20th century, and three important cultural shifts and scientific discoveries transformed homemaking at the time, okay? So the first was a breakthrough in bacteriology. Today, we all know, bacteria make you sick, but back then, germ theory was just accepted among the public in the late 19th century. All right, so scientists came to understand that germs, rather than bad smell, causes disease and infection. Yet as antidotes, hygiene and sanitation to keep your house clean prevented them. So the second, which happened around 1910s, was the discovery of vitamins and minerals. We realized that these elements in food provided better nutrition and make us healthy. And third, it's unbelievable today, but back then people just started to realize how important childhood is. So instead of putting children in child labor, we should give them education, we should give them nurture, we should give them protection, okay? So there's changing belief in the 1930s that we should care more for our children. And we should respect their developmental patterns. All right, so because of this, so what this all means is that disease became controllable and preventable through domestic cleanliness and adequate nutrition. And it shifted the responsibility for the well-being of the household members from fate to homemakers, okay? So before they're trusting their health to God, and now the responsibility has shifted to homemakers who are primarily women. So since the 1870s, a historian Cohen found out that women are actually working longer hours at home despite the increasing availability of household labor-saving equipment. And Mokir, in his 2000 paper in JEH, argued that this is exactly because the scientific discoveries and cultural shifts that make housekeeping a lot more harder. All right, now these discoveries get formalized into a women's curriculum, and more specifically, evolved into subfields of home economics. Okay, so what is home economics? It's nothing to do with economics. In the early 19th century, so home economics is a field or a curriculum for women that's as old as time. Okay, but in the beginning, it teaches housekeeping and etiquette. So basically, how to be a lady and how to keep a house. But because of these new contents that were put into housekeeping, home economics added subfields in hygiene and sanitation, in food and nutrition, in childcare and human development. Okay. Now, hygiene and sanitation is a subfield in home economics that's closely related or built on the science specific in biology and public health. Food and nutrition is a discipline or a major created by home economics, and it's based on sciences in chemistry. Childcare and human development is another field developed by home economics or invented by home economics. And today this major is called developmental psychology. All right, so there are efforts by pioneers in home economics to share commitment to the scientific standards of teaching home economics. So as a signal of that, the first organized meeting of home economics, or the establishment of American Home Economics Association, occurred in 1899. All right, so this is a place in time when home economics begin to become more scientific. Now, besides the historical background of home economics, so the germ theory at the time, an important influence on home economics curriculum actually came through the early and continuing association with agricultural colleges. So this is a bit surprising and, well, I guess a little bit artificial. So home economics as a college major was legitimized by land-grant universities, and in particular, it was coded as an agricultural major at the time. But let me go back a little bit. What is land-grant universities? Since I'm talking to a mostly Chinese audience, so land-grant universities are the first federal universities established by the US government, and there's usually one in each state. And the land-grant universities focus teaching on practical science. And most importantly, land-grant universities differ in that they established agricultural studies for rural men. So they want to teach farmers to grow their crops in a more scientific way and to learn to use the new machineries in agriculture. As agriculture studies developed and as land-grant universities came to shape, they realized that, you know, we're giving men all this education. We might as well teach rural women something as well. So home economics as a college major developed as a feminine parallel to agriculture education at land-grant universities. Okay, so here is a paragraph that that trustees of Iowa State used to convince this college to enroll women. Okay, it says, if young men are to be educated to fit them for successful, intelligent, and practical farmers and mechanics, is it not essential that young women should be educated in a manner that will qualify them to properly understand and discharge their duties as wives of farmers and mechanics? So, and they're gonna And as a result, they argue that we should increase facilities for scientific instruction with a prominent place for the study of domestic economy. So it's the study of home economics. So home economics was actually a critical pathway for women to go into higher education at the time. All right, so what does it mean that home economics was coded as an agricultural subject? Well, I guess most importantly, it means home economics will have money, will have government support. Right. So teaching in research and researching home economics qualify for funding at the USDA, so United States Department of Agriculture. And okay, and the money comes from the Hatch Act of 1887. It was the most important funding for agricultural research as USDA, and home economics qualify equally for funding from Hatch Act. More than that, the Office of Home Economics was opened in 1915 in the Department of U.S. Agriculture. So within the Bureau, there's an Office of Home Economics, and they hire home economists in this bureau. At the college level, it means that many home ec departments initiated as a department under agricultural college. And this college affiliation means sharing of distribution requirement or the prerequisites, okay, or the first year courses. And what is agriculture? Agriculture is an interdisciplinary science in biology, okay? So typically home economics students were overly exposed in biological sciences. In the first year, they typically have to take courses in chemistry, bacteriology, and physiology. This is just to convince you that Hatch Act included home economics, okay, among all these other agricultural fields, and included a lot of biology. But to show you that these grants are meaningful and it doesn't discriminate against home economics, I want to show you how like the private funds and land grant translated into enrollment. So how large the program is. This is 1910 data, by the way. This is a cross section. So the public funds at land grant goes into agriculture and home economics around the same magnitude, and it didn't go into like any other major, not even in engineering. Okay, all right, so home ec and agriculture are closely related, and agriculture curriculum would influence the scientific content in home economics. And later I'm going to exploit this relationship a bit more to see if we can use agricultural enrollment as an instrument. All right, we went into course catalogs to see like the curriculum of what home economics students actually had to take. I will just give you some snapshots. In Cornell Catalog 1910, it says women who wish to specialize in home economics must complete the same core courses as men in agriculture, covering biology, chemistry, physics, physiology, and bacteriology. In Utah State Catalog in 1911, students in domestic science must complete courses in general chemistry and plant physiology in the freshman year. They must also take classes in bacteriology, advanced physiology, and chemistry in the sophomore year. In Iowa State, they have something similar to Cornell. Okay, first year courses in home ec was identical with courses in agriculture. So we spent a semester and just coding the course, the course catalogs over time. Okay, so this is what a typical course catalogs look like. So it tells you that, for example, in the fall quarter, you have to take 4 credits in chemistry. You have to take 8 credits in health economics. So these are a course in hygiene. And then in the winter quarter, another chemistry, physics, biology, blah, blah, blah. So what we do is we want to know, like, what's the share of these biology, chemistry courses in home economics that's required to complete a home economics major. And as we can see that especially in the beginning, okay, biology and chemistry courses, and these are not applied courses, these are just courses in like hardcore chemistry or biology from the biology or chemistry department. Like 40% of required hours in home ec was in biology and chemistry. And even though the share sort of declined over time, by 1940s and 1950s, they still have to take 20% of courses in biology and chemistry. So the exposure, so 20% is almost about a first spending a year just study these basic sciences. All right, which came to our hypothesis, which is we want to argue that home economics, although it's conservative and focuses on training women to be better qualified wives, it actually opened a gateway for women to enter into science. And we argue that women came to dominate fields in biology and biological sciences because they were exposed to these subjects in large numbers through collegiate home economics curricula in the early 20th century. So in the rest of the paper, we try to find data to establish this relationship. So some preview of findings. So in the short run, we do see that opening home economics department increase the percentage of women in science. So this is women in science divided by total number of students in science. And we also see that on the intensive margin, as the share of women in home economics increased, the share of women in science relative to other fields increased as well. Okay. All right. So just to fix ideas. So how do we think about why home economics increase women's enrollment in science? So I would like to just give a sketch of theoretical framework that we situated our study in. All right. So so the theoretical framework borrowed from the Otongji setup, where choosing a major is a sequential choice under uncertainty. Okay. So here are the steps. Individual choosing a field of study to maximize her ex ante utility, but the utility is a sum of expected income and non-pecuniary preferences, a component which we will call preferences. Okay, why is there uncertainty? Well, we've all been to college because we only learn gradually about our ability to succeed in certain fields, and we learn gradually what is our true type. Okay, so for a woman, do I really want to be a stay-at-home mom as my mother and my grandmother had done, or do I actually have a preference to be a career woman, okay, or is it both? All right. Now, even though individual can gradually learn about the ability to succeed in different fields, switching field is usually costly. So if you switch fields in your, say, second year, third year, it's likely that you will not graduate, or at least graduate in time, in 4 years. Okay, so switching field is costly. Okay, so for simplicity, let's define preferences as taste. Okay, for example, we can have women who prefer marriage strictly and dislike school, and she will not postpone marriage in order to go to college and earn a higher wage. There are women who prefer careers, and in particular career in humanities, what we call letters, or women who prefer careers in science, or women just who prefers career and she's indifferent between whether it's a career in letters or in science. Okay, and before attending college, a woman sort of have priors on each type, like 50% a career type or 50% marriage type, or definitely a marriage type. Okay, preferences are only revealed after the first year of college. So even though you might be a like marriage type, it might worth it to attend college for 1 year and know it for sure. All right, so what did home economics do? So first of all, because home economics is a major design for for wives and moms, you will induce the high ability or women with reasonable ability, but marriage type to attend college. They think attending college will increase their marriage quality or their home production. Okay, now for these women that would have otherwise not go to college, they will attend home economics, and after first year, true preferences are revealed. So some women will realize that they actually have high ability in science and they have a preference for career or career in science. All right. For this woman, they can switch to science major with very little cost because of the overlapping in content between home economics and science. All right. So in this case, we may find that if there's more women going into home economics, there'll be more women ending up studying science. Okay, so this is first channel, and we have a really good example that it's our favorite example. So this woman is Vita Kim, and she attended college intending to become a home ec teacher, so to do home ec related stuff. But during which she fell in love with chemistry, and eventually she obtained a PhD in thermochemistry from the University of Chicago, and she went on a successful career in General Mills, so a career in science. Okay, so this is an example of how home economics, the exposure of home economics push women into science. Now there is another channel, which is now that women know. Okay, so these are academic type women who could be ambiguous, ambivalent about whether to go to letters or go to science. And they may just prefer to go into letters because they know a lot more women who are successful in letters. But now, because they know if science major doesn't work out, she could still switch to home economics and graduate with reasonable ability. Okay, this would increase her ex ante utility to study science relative to study humanity. All right, I hope that's clear. So a woman who's indifferent between these two fields now has a larger incentive to start college with science. So as an empirical prediction, okay, this says no matter how large the home ec program is, as long as this program exists and it overlap enough science courses, say in the first year, okay, this would increase women in science. All right, so the channel 2 is more like a thought exercise, and we couldn't find any anecdotal evidence on this channel. All right, so some may wonder what's the home ec effect on labor force participation? And this is gonna be tricky because according to model, home economics it has a selection bias. So you select the marriage type into home economics, and these women are not more likely to work. But maybe home economics will increase labor force participation in technical fields because they pushed women into science or because home economics was scientific enough. All right, and then because there are more women in science, It might be transmitted intergenerationally, and this might change the initial belief on types if women believe that, you know, that they can also be successful or they can also enjoy a career in sciences. All right, for the time being, I'm gonna skip this. So I think, so one of the contribution in our paper is that we look at how historical shock can change the norms in academic stereotypes. And we provided a cultural explanation among many other explanations to education choices that stem from historical development in women's curricula. All right, so for the data, so the data was collected by my co-author, Mike Andrews, for his innovation project, where he wanted to link college students to patentees. All right, so we have 20 yearbooks spanning from year 1900 to 1940, although not continuous. And we have for each yearbooks, okay, if you want to look at what yearbooks look like, we have their name. So Fanny Alice Gannon from Gilman, Iowa. So we know that she comes from the state of Iowa, and she studied home economics and does all these other things. And here is a case where this woman, Marianne Harriet, she double majored in home economics and science. Okay, and she also comes from Iowa. So this is what yearbooks look like. And it took him a National Science Foundation equals to $20,000 to transcribe these 20 yearbooks. And we try to have coverage in multiple states. All right, so so from these yearbooks, we have about 97 students, 9,700 students, 1,000 students. And for each of them, we typically observe their name, where they come from, and their declared major. So we don't know whether they are women or men, but we can infer the probability of being a man by linking their name to censuses. Okay, so we will link Mary to Iowa census in 1920 and see in that year, in that state, how many people that called Mary are men, and the probability is really low, it's 0.07, so we know that Mary is probably a woman. Now, this data set is not perfect, so it has a lot of missing years, missing majors, and it seriously undercount science majors. Okay, so at some point, instead of declaring science majors, a lot of them declared arts and science as majors. So we give our most conservative estimate and say, look, these are not science majors. Okay, if they say it's arts and science. However, I have to mention that this is the only data set that we are aware of that has the gender and major component in the early 20th century. All right, so as you can see, the coverage is not great. So all these yearbooks are downloaded from ancestry.com, and sometimes there's just no yearbook for universities, or very few yearbooks for universities. And so even though we started with 20 colleges, we have to drop colleges that doesn't have science in certain years. So in the end, our panel consists of 14 colleges. Okay. All right, so let's explore the yearbook data a little bit more. So I want to show that, sure, home economics was a critical way for a woman to enter into higher education. We see that more women, so 57% of women in our sample were enrolled in colleges with home economics. But more critically, home economics pushed women into science. So 93% of women who actually declared major in science in our sample were enrolled in colleges with home economics. Okay, and this is not because home economics, so colleges with home economics are more scientific. We see that men who declared major in science are equally likely to go into colleges that with home economics or or without. But for women, this disproportionately concentrate in colleges with home economics. So this is to fix an idea that, women in science and home economics are correlated. If we break down the distribution of their science majors further, okay, we see a big chunk of general science. This is when science is not break down further. And we see that none of the, actually there are like five women in physics, and the rest of them go into biology, chemistry, and psychology, all right? So even though home economics correlate with women in science, home economics is more specifically correlated with biological sciences. All right, so in our sample, about half of the colleges added home economics major over time. And if we just look at the fraction of men in science, so if the fraction is 1 or close to 1, it means men in science are, sorry, the students in science are all male. And if we look at the group of colleges that never had home economics, okay, so no home economics, the red line, the fraction of men is almost always 1. All right, but if we look at the colleges that at some point had home economics, the estimated fraction of men in science gradually decreased. Okay, so once there are home economics, like there are more women in science, so the gender ratio become more balanced. I still don't know what happened over here. This is the green line is for the fraction of men in science at colleges that always had home economics. All right, so our empirical strategy is a panel study. So we want to look at within, for each college, what happens when home economics major became available, and what's the relationship between the size of home economics and the size of women in science. Control for college, some college characteristics, college fixed effect, and some time variables. Okay. Okay, so more specifically, so we're interested in relationship in levels. Okay, we're also interested on the outcome according to our model predictions. So what's the percentage of women in science relative to other fields? Okay, so we want to subtract the number of women in home economics. For example, this is number of women in science over the number of women in letters. All right, and finally, even though our model doesn't predict what happens with the gender ratio, we're interested in the gender ratio because, this is how we measure gender gap in certain majors today. All right, so it's amazing that anything will work given how fragmented our data is, but there seems to be something, okay? So even though it's undercounted, we do see that on the levels, the number of women in home economics increase with the number of women in science. So on the extensive margin, it's not significant, but it's still positive. Okay, so when home economics is available, it seems to be that there are more women in science. So the share of women in home economics also increased the share of women in science relative to other fields. Okay, and compare before and after a home economics program exists. Okay, the gender ratio becomes more balanced. So the fraction of women in science increased. So you might observe that the observations become much smaller than the number of yearbooks we have. This is because first we have to restrict the sample to after 1910. So this is when home economics become more scientific. And second, we have to drop college years that doesn't have any science enrollment. And we have to drop Cornell because in Cornell, and the home economics major had a lot of men in it. So that's why we have fewer observations. All right, so there's question with selection. So whether, you know, women would migrate to colleges that offer science. So we further restrict our sample to within state students. So like Iowa students would attend Iowa State. I was also concerned that because we had so few colleges, the estimates may be biased by one college. So I tried dropping one college at a time, and the result is robust to that. So in the previous slide, the time trends are, so the times are breaking up into 3 intervals. But I also tried linear trends or decade fixed effect, and the results are robust to that. Year fixed effect may stress out regression too much, given like there are 40 years over 120 observations. So we lost power, but the size of the coefficient is quite stable. All right. Okay, so this is the panel estimates from the in-state student only. We have about 80% of students that are in-state, and women, we find out, are disproportionately more likely to study in their own state. So they're less likely to travel to study. So what this means is that, you know, women would happen to be pushed into science because the state college or the land-grant college in her state happened to open home economics in the years that she attended college. All right, so that's the analysis from the panel we constructed. We also have a cross-section data set in 1910, and it was the only administrative cross-section we have that both have enrollment by major and gender. All right, so the advantage of this data set is that it's more comprehensive. We observe a lot more college characteristics, such as endowment, how many books in the library, number of faculties, number of major offered. And for land grants specifically, we observe like how much teaching spending is on science. We observe, you know, how much science equipment the college have. So we have some measures to control for how scientific that college is. This is what the data looks like. Okay, so for household economy, so this is our home economics, we can observe how many women and men are in this major. All right. So from this administration report, we see that land grant, okay, was truly the only college type that offered agricultural studies to men. There was about 20% of men in land grant study agriculture, and about 20% of women at land grant studied home economics. Okay, I also want to point out that first, the percentage women in science is the largest at land grant, and second, women overall still tend to major in classics, education, okay, and music. So these are the 3 other alternative majors that women tend to major in. All right, so we still find this intensive margin result in the cross section. So we see that home economics correlated with the number of women in general science, and women in classical education, on the other hand, doesn't. Okay, and then we sequentially controlled for like how scientific that school is, how rich that college is, so by looking at the endowment, and finally the sources of funding. Okay, and the estimates are rather robust. And then we run placebo tests. So we redid this regression, replacing women in home economics with women in other fields. And you can see that women in classical education or music or education doesn't correlate with women in science enrollment at all, okay? Whereas women in home economics is positive and significantly correlated with women in science. We can run the same test using whether a home economics major exists on the gender ratio in science in that land-grant college, given that science existed as a land-grant. And we see that compared to classical education or music or education, home economics is the most significant predictor on the gender ratio in science. Okay, it's positive because there are more women in science at the college. And finally, as I introduced earlier in time, because home economics had this artificial tie with agriculture program, it sort of tags along as an agriculture major. We tried using the size of agriculture program to instrument for the size of home economics. So if that land grant happened to have a larger demand in agriculture, it might like share some of the resources into their home economics program. So that home economics program is also larger. So we see that it's still, it's definitely valid. So manning agriculture does significantly correlated with women in home economics. And as a reduced form, the size of agriculture program does predict women or the number of women enrolled in general science. So even though colleges with more men in agriculture tend to be more scientific, it's not significant. So colleges with agriculture are not that more scientific on the measures that we can observe. And if we run a two-stage least square on land grants only, we do see that home economics, women in home economics increased the number of women in general science. And the estimates are somewhat comparable. Okay, so finally, people are gonna ask about labor market outcomes. So my co-author and I, we are really question this result ourselves. So this is something that should be taken with a grain of salt. So we try to estimate the female home ec rate, which is how many women at the college age were in that county, and how many of them, and how many women enrolled in home economics in that county. So this is the rate of women in home economics, and we try to regress it on the labor force participation rate and labor force participation rate in technical occupations in that county. Okay, so we do find that even though home economics doesn't increase total female labor force participation in that county, it does seem to push up the share of women in technical occupations. But we don't know how much we believe the statistics, given how small the percentage of women in technical occupation is. Okay, so this is some result that should be taken with a grain of salt. There was only 3% of women in technical occupation in 1910. So, and given how few women attended college and attended home economics, the fact that we find positive results could be driven by, noise. All right. This is a big challenge. All right, so one reason, so here's where I'm going to attack my own IV, the restriction exclusion assumption. So, why are there more men in agriculture in certain land grants. Okay, so why in certain states there is a larger demand for agriculture? And I find that it has nothing to do with how many like the agriculture employment in that state, but it has to do with how mechanic agriculture is in that state. So the predictor of agriculture sciences and the land grant is the value of farm equipment. Okay, so this could indicate that agricultural. This could indicate that the counties with more, the states with larger agricultural programs teaches more scientific agriculture. And if that is what's driving the result, then the IV analysis doesn't really satisfy the exclusion restriction. However, if we believe that this is a far distance between how mechanized agriculture is in that state and the number of women in science, we do make some progress in understanding the causality, okay, between the number of women in home economics and the number of women that were spilled over to science. All right, which brings me to the conclusion. So we argue that home economics expanded women's enrollment in science through heavy exposure to science subjects in its curriculum. And our cross-section focused on a time where home economics is tiny, okay? So as home economics programs expanded to other state universities and private universities, and suppose that it keeps its scientific standard relatively high, okay, can we, if we extrapolate the panel estimates that we find, this would imply a reasonably broad impact on women's entry to science, at least before 1950, okay. All right, so what our model doesn't say, okay, is that home economics actually invented a lot of fields, such as field in public health, studies of nutrition, and developmental psychology, etc. And these are the fields that concentrated a lot of women, and they may continue to serve like home economics to bring women into science. So even though home economics becomes largely irrelevant today, public health, nutrition, developmental psychology are the scientific majors that are female dominated, okay, and very scientific. So they may continue to bring women into science. And in that way, the legacy of home economics program will persist through these majors. And finally, we offer an alternative view on academic preferences, how it is formed based on these historical shocks. And we hope that through the example of home economics, we showed how preferences can be shaped and altered through forced exposure and changing incentives. So thank you all for participating and listening to the talk. Thank you. I think I ended on time.
Okay, thank you so much, Yiling. Now let's invite Professor Sung-Yong Park to discuss for 10 to 15 minutes. Okay. Okay, Sung-Yong.
Okay, let me share my screen. Can you see it?
Yeah.
Yeah, very good.
Okay, so Yiling, thank you for the nice presentation. It was a pleasure to read the paper. I enjoyed it very much. The discussion is mostly prepared on the previous version. I saw that it slightly changed now you have a model, so it's much more rich. But I think there are some maybe something that you can take away from this. Okay, so I'll start. Okay, so let me just give a brief summary. So the paper uses historical college level data and data collected from the yearbooks to examine the effect of home economics program on women's enrollment in science major. The paper basically employs two empirical strategies. The first is a cross-sectional in the 1910 data, and then difference in difference from the 1910 to the 1940 panel data. The paper reports positive and significant effects of home economics program on women's enrollment in general science. So from the cross-sectional data, it suggests that there was about a 0.1 to 0.2 increase in number of women for every additional woman enrolling in home economics program. And the difference in difference suggests that the existence of a home economics program increases the fraction of women in general science by about 0.14. So overall, I think the paper tackles a very important question that can contribute to our understanding of the gender gap in college science majors and possibly beyond, which I think would make the paper much more interesting. The authors conducted a detailed investigation on the historical background and institutions. And also, we have to acknowledge that it takes a great deal of effort to digitize and process these data. So I want to really give my appreciation to the authors. Additionally, the paper finds a sizable impact of the home economics college program on women's enrollment in science majors, and as Yiling already talked about it, so that might have very important implications for curriculum design and how the curriculum can interact with gender-based preferences in learning, and also for women's entering into these type of majors and occupations. So overall, I think I learned a lot from the current version, and I do look forward to reading the final draft. Hopefully some of the comments here would help that process. So here are my first set of comments. It's quote unquote big picture because it's largely subjective. So you can just decide whether how much these are actually big pictures. So my first comment was how to interpret the paper's findings. So and there is a theoretical framework, and Yiling discusses about it. But one way to look at it is this really about shaping women's preferences? For example, because they now take these science courses in college, that can boost their confidence. So it is really shaping like how women would feel about taking science major. Or is it simply just a gateway in the sense that now it's the cost of enrolling in science is lower because you're already in the home economics program. So reducing that cost might just simply lead more females to major in science. I think that might have different implications for policy and also in terms of understanding how, like for example, female can join more like STEM fields or STEM occupations. So one takeaway, one point here is that there are studies, actually a large literature showing that these type of gender-based preferences actually start to form very early in the stage of education. If you look at middle school and high school, female students already are much more likely to study biology and chemistry relative to physics. So yeah, so that's something to think about when you're serious about interpreting this as shaping women's preference. So the second comment is, what can this paper tell us about the gender gap in STEM occupation? So I know that Yiling like briefly talked about labor force participation and occupation. But so there's a paper in Jolie that shows that more exposure to female peers in high school reduces women probability of working in STEM occupations. So Yiling here is saying that home economics program increases females' enrollment in science. So you're going to have more female peers in college. How is that going to interact like with deciding their careers, for example, whether they're going to work in a STEM field? And then the final comment is, I think the paper can somewhat strengthen. I know that the authors show a lot of anecdotal evidence, but maybe talk a bit more about the mechanism of whether, like, how home economics is really channeling more and more females to science major. I think a possible alternative explanation is home economics major may have higher female faculty ratio. Like there's this paper in the QJE showing that female professors have a positive and significant effect on females' performance in math and science. So, if this program is much more dominated by female professors, and that might be the mechanism of why we see more female students taking on the science majors. Right, so I think like more detailed documentation of the mechanism would be much more helpful in understanding the key message of the paper. Okay, so these are these are more like nitty-gritty comments. So some concerns with the identification strategy. So I think Yiling actually already and the co-author already somewhat incorporated this. So I think the analysis with the cross section, like the sample size is small, and inference with IV might be a little. I think it has to be careful. So maybe the cross sectional should be more like descriptive evidence to motivate the panel analysis. And I think they might want to try another outcome variable like the gender ratio, which I think they might have. And then I noticed that in the table, like there was no F-stat for the IB. So something that the authors can add. Another comment is, this is more like confounding factors. So expansion of home economics program can just reflect increase in demand for female education in science or shift in the women's labor supply. So during and after World War I, which is, I think, when the home economics program starts to really take off, there was a boost in scientific career opportunities for women, especially because of this movement of trying to realign science to some of the military objectives. So whether that might be just a confounding factor to why home economics program expanded, and also where there were more females entering into the science majors. Finally, so this is, I don't know how important this might be, but especially since there is evidence that high school curriculum is also important for shaping female preference. And if that might vary across states, I don't know how uniform it was, but if there is difference in school curricula across genders and that varies across state and further changing over time, that might be also another confounding factor to the findings. So for instance, girls in middle or high school take more courses in math or science subjects. In states that are more likely to have a home economics program, could that be possibly confounding the finding? Also, it might be useful to know what were the prerequisites for entering into college with the home economics major and with the science major. Did they have to take like some biology courses in high school or math courses in high school? Something that might just provide more better understanding of what were like the cross school or cross state differences and the condition for enrolling in home economics. Finally, these are just more minor ad hoc comments. For matching name and gender, maybe they can conduct a robustness check by dropping probability matches that were below a more like stricter threshold. I think currently they use below 50% male as an indicator for female, but maybe you can try something that's more rigorous. Yeah, I think you showed some pictures. Maybe you can know the specific major within science or not. I'm not sure, like you have chemistry and physics. I'm just wondering, like within general sciences, can we like somewhat distinguish between whether these are the nowadays female dominated majors or is it the male dominated majors? Another comment is about external validity. So the courses offered in science major at land grant might be different from those offered in the non-land grant universities. This is something I think you guys can just check between like private universities and land grant, like whether they actually offer the similar courses. Also, so I think Yiling, you explained this. So I was wondering why you have a lot of yearbooks and why there were only 122 observations. You mentioned that you dropped the ones before 1910, right? So
yeah, and surprisingly, a lot of colleges didn't offer science majors at the time.
I see.
So we have to drop the college years that doesn't have any science enrollment.
Okay.
Which boils down to not many colleges, unfortunately.
I see. This is a minor comment. So in the figure that was in the draft, it seemed not so obvious why you would want to have the year
Oh, the year
the
interval. It's because the
yeah
the trend is weird for the group
yeah
that always had home
right
economics, so I sort of break it down. But yeah, so I tried using decades, so 10-year
right
fixed
right
effect, and it doesn't actually change the
right
result very much.
right. And then
Um,
finally, just adding some summary statistics can help thinking about the economic significance. So I was also
yeah,
trying. I
sorry, I
mean,
was
you
too
show
lazy in
statistical
making a table.
significance. I also want to like gauge
Of
whether it's
course, of
significant
course.
economically. Yeah. Yeah. So overall,
Yep.
yeah, it was a very nice paper. I was very happy to read it.
Yeah, thank you so much for the comment. I find them to be very useful, and I'm going to download all the papers that you mentioned that I haven't read. But a couple comments on high school.
Yeah.
Okay. So to put it shortly, at the time, college was the early stage of formal education for most people in the US. So in 1910, like less than 10% of population graduate from high school, and colleges were like the first time when people can receive like a 4-year fixed curriculum formal knowledge education. And so I don't believe they would be exposed to science as much at the time, which makes our setup really, really nice. Yeah. Oh, and for World War One, I believe there is something going on there. So my graph also shows like a huge dip in gender ratio, meaning more women going to science around World War One. And I think a lot of the majors concentrated in chemistry. So maybe, all of a sudden in World War One, they're learning to prepare food because there's food shortage. So they're learning to maximize nutrition out of these food. Maybe. I think that's something interesting to explore. Yeah. So also, can I answer the question from David in the Q&A? But thank you, Sayan, so much.
Yeah. So now let's turn to the question from Professor David Mitch.
Yes, so thank you.
Yeah. I should read this question in order other audience can also know the question. Okay. Yeah, David has 3 questions. First, I'm wondering about what role home economics and the entry into science would have played in private women's college in the US in the early 20th century. Did this college offer home economics courses, or did they have them as not suitable for their students? Do you think the same or similar mechanisms were at work in these colleges as for land grants? Second, I thought in the late 19th century, women interested in science started in home economics related field like nutrition because they were not allowed or strongly discouraged from majoring in pure sciences. Third, could you comment on whether similar mechanisms could be at work in countries such as China? Is there a general tendency for women to prefer life science fields and medicine, whether in the US or in China?
Yeah, I'm going to answer the question backwards. So I've been trying to find gender data by major in China, and it's highly restrictive, and it was just impossible for me to have any statistics to say anything about that, unfortunately. But there's something interesting in that US-style universities influenced Chinese-style universities and curriculum in the early 20th century. So when I was looking at the course catalogs at PKU, for example, I also see that PKU was a Methodist college established by the United States missionaries, and they also included home economics as a major for women in the early 20th century. So maybe there will be something but I just can't say without data on gender major composition in China. And second, yeah, maybe women were frowned upon to major in pure sciences, but we would never be able to know that whether they were discriminated and whether they were less discriminated in places with home ec. But we do have anecdotal evidence. So in so some women who take like bacteriology classes. So bacteriology was extremely male dominated in the early 20th century. So there's a woman who went into bacteriology, and the professor asked her, well, what are you doing here? And then she said, well, I came to learn bacteriology so that I can educate other girls how important it is to keep your sponges clean. So they might use these feminine answers to persuade men that it is important that women understand science. I think that's actually a very interesting perspective. So this woman can go into science because men accept the fact that it's important for women to understand the science in order to become better wives and housekeepers. Okay, and third, about like female colleges. So we do have them in the cross section. And with female colleges, it's they do have home economics. So in the 1910 sample, home economics either exists in the co-ed land grant or in female colleges. But I don't, so with female colleges, it's trickier because you couldn't look at gender ratio. But maybe I can include the result on, like, are there more women in science at female colleges that have home economics? I think the extra validity is severely challenged in the 1910 at least, because in land grant we know that because of the affiliation with agriculture and their access to a health check funding, they maintain a high standard, high scientific standard in teaching home economics. But I'm just worried that the extra validity will not work because in other universities their curriculum is not as scientific. So that's my answers for David.
Okay, perfect. So now let's turn to the questions by our colleague at Hong Kong U Gender Study, Professor Elizabeth Lakota. I'm a historian in this field, so my questions come from a different place than an economist. The first question on curriculum and the gender-based choice. The paper seems to putting today's educational values onto the data of the past. Today, we value STEAM and it's tended to be gendered masculine, and yet you note in the past, some institutions did not even have science majors some years. Could it be that classics or history was more valued than science in the past, and that is why science was home economics or female adjacent or agriculture masculine in the past? Okay, let me finish the second question. The second question, is this about home economics as a subject, or is it about educational systems in particular places and at the particular historical moments in time? In other words, I wonder if this is about land-grant universities and not about home economics. Taking Japan as an example, Japan was the leader of home economics education in East Asia, beginning in the 19th century, influencing China, Taiwan, and Korea. Home economics is still taught in schools to girls and boys in Japan today. But on women in home economics in China, so Helen Schneider's work, Keeping the Nation's House. I have also written on this. Enrollment numbers were low. It was not a popular subject with Chinese women before the Second World War. Yes.
Yeah, I have to check out this work. Yeah, thank you so much for the suggestions. Let me see how I can answer them. I didn't know that Japan was the leader in home economics education. That's really interesting. A particular historical moments in time. Yeah, so I don't know enough about home economics in other countries, unfortunately. But yes, I do think it's more about the education system in the US. And it's about the content in home economics rather than, so it's both the content and the symbol of what home economics is. So the symbol says home economics is a major for women. It's a major that women can take. And then the content says home economics is a lot of science. So I think it's just these two elements combined that pushed women into science or exposed women into science. And it's these two functions that work. If home economics is teaching cooking eggs and sewing clothes, it will not have the same effect on science. Yeah, so you mentioned something extremely interesting because US education history was largely composed of private universities that taught classical education. So before 20th century or before land grant came along, students were learning Greeks, Latin, and a very brief introduction in science or math. Yeah, so as I show you in the data in 1910, most men and women at the time were still studying classics education, and like these abstract sciences actually mattered a lot more, was considered more important for a larger part of the history. Now, why did science only came along in the 20th century? I think it's because, these biological sciences and chemistry were not as important, or we don't know that much. So as human beings, we have only recently found out about germs, about vitamins and minerals, about chemistry components. So science become more important in the 20th century, and colleges slowly begin to add like general science or specific science majors, as we have more scientists in this field. Wait, what did I want to say? Okay, but even though science was a small field to start with, I still see from the aggregate data, for example, biology was all men in 1910. But in 1950, however, when we break down biology, you see that bacteriology already has 50% of women in it. So even though we're talking about small and growing field in the 20th century, oh, I'm terrible at answering questions. So even though it's a small and growing field, it doesn't mean that it's insignificant. And I think it does like translate into STEM participation today through this intergenerational communication. But this reminds me that I should do some persistent study, maybe at the college level, and to see if the past translates into present more formally. Yeah, thank you so much, Elizabeth, for your questions. I will definitely check out your work as well.
Yeah, so thank you, Elizabeth. Very good comment and question. The next question comes from a master student at LSA, Fan Junqi. Hey, thank you for the very insightful presentation. But I was wondering if the goals of the home economics program to train a good wife and a mother contradicts with the goals of a science major to think independently and comprehensively. How does home economics encourage women to join the science programs?
Yeah, okay. Yeah, so you're asking a hard question here because home economics is very conservative and very progressive at the same time. So even though it was advertised to teach women to become better wives, which seems to contradict with all the scientific spirit, I have to mention that the first woman who pioneered home economics was a chemist, a woman chemist who graduated from MIT. Okay, so what she wanted to do is to professionalize what women were already doing at home. So, so even though most women who were attracted to this major want to become mothers and wives, it does allow women who wanted to have a scientific career to it also helps women who wanted to have a scientific career at the same time. So it seems contradictory, but both things are happening. Like the home economics faculties actually want women to go out home and be able to have scientific careers, either as nutritionists or chemists or other professionists. So I think maybe at some level, home economics does encourage women to be more, well, I don't think encourages women to join a science program per se, but it doesn't discriminate women to go into a science program, to put it that way. And also the exposure of scientific content in the home economics will make some women realize what their true type, what their true preferences or ability is. Okay, so they may realize something about themselves while they were at home economics, and they can switch to science because it's relatively costless. Right, so I think there's a bit ideology reason why home economics encourage women into science, but I also think that a lot of it comes from the exposure and content and the fact that it makes it socially less costly to go into science. Yeah, thank you for your question. I hope I answered some of the concerns.
Thank you so much, Yiling. So now we can address all the questions from the audience. Well, finally, Professor Chen, I think you may want to ask something.
Yes,
Okay,
please.
yeah, thank you, Zhichen. Well, thank you, Yiling. Sorry, I have a cold. So, well, this is a very good research design. I think the home economics program served a very good sort of historical natural experiment to see whether how exposure to science will change the major choices and career choice for women. But on the other hand, I noticed that maybe some some selection biases in terms of which states offered or started land grant universities, and how the Hatch Act have affected some states, but not other states where they did not have such universities. Remember when I was at Wisconsin, there was a large home economics department. When I was there in the early 90s, I think, yeah, they were not so impactful on the campus anymore. But I did notice on one of your slides, when you look at the three groups of universities, the land grant universities, the non-land grant universities, and then private universities. So the percentage of female students majoring in science, private schools was also pretty high, almost as high as the land grant universities. So I don't know, what that really means. Maybe it means, the home economics program, that's one of the ways to expose some women and trigger their interest in science, but there could also be other ways, right? So the private universities, I guess, the students were more likely to have been exposed when they were growing up to various other topics, whereas for the farmers' daughters in the grant universities, early on in their childhood, they may not have been exposed to science, or they may not have grown up in a somewhat liberal cultural environment, would not be exposed or would not be thinking about measuring in science, because you did not talk much about private universities. That kind of offers another angle to understanding why there may be certain underrepresentations in science majors, but not in other science majors. Anyway, it's a very interesting paper. Thank you.
Yeah, you mentioned some really good points. So, so our panel is composed of large universities, and that are largely that I think we have a couple private, most of them are public universities. So we may have a bias from the type of universities that's in our sample. And I picked, so I focused on land grant because of the, like how it's related to the legitimization of home economics, and I feel like the colleges are more comparable there. But it is true that I also noticed women, especially women in all female schools, also took a lot of science. Although the percentage is not as high as in land grant, but it was still higher than say in state colleges. And I think you were right that maybe women who attended land grant versus women who attended private colleges come from very different socioeconomic backgrounds, which maybe I'm able to see from like where the colleges are, like location. Maybe I can control for location a bit better. But I do think that at least at private universities, women tend to come from upper class because private universities are expensive. And land grants were free, so you had a much larger enrollment than private schools, and land grant attracted maybe lower or middle income families than women from upper level upper level classes. But and it's true that when I read historical narrative, upper class American women were encouraged to study science from very beginning. But again, it's on the same logic, so that they can help their husband to keep account, and they can and science can prevent superstition. So yeah, so maybe there is some class elements there. What home economics did was to introduce the lower class, more general population to study science.
Yeah, you may also control for the sort of religious denominational dominance or distribution, and also the red states versus blue states in the U.S. Yeah, there may be some, of course, some of the controls you have included already picked up. But if you have not included such factors, you may try them, see whether will pick up some of the effects.
Yeah, that's a good idea. So to control for more general cultural attitudes like conservatism. Yep.
Yeah.
Yep, okay, and also
to
consider the types of university. Great. I got so much useful comment. Thank you so much.
Okay, perfect. So thank you so much, Yiling, and thank you so much, Sang-Yong, for your discussion. This is the last webinar of this year, so we also thank all colleagues, friends, and audience for your support for our webinar series. We also thank our coordinator, Ms. Beth Kwok, and our Mr. Graham Wang for their excellent technical support and the coordination. So finally, please receive our season's greeting from our QH team and University of Hong Kong. We wish you a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. So for the audience, please sign up to our mailing list to receive the upcoming events. So we look forward to seeing you in the new year. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
See you in 2022.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you so much,
Okay, bye.
Chichen and
Bye.
Sanyong. Bye.
Bye.